Saul Landau is a groundbreaking Emmy-winning documentary filmmaker, a noted scholar, author, poet, and commentator. He's a senior fellow of the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. He is also a fearless mixture of a little bit of Gore Vidal, Michael Moore, and perhaps Christopher Hitchens. Landau's newest documentary film tells the story of the case of the Cuban Five. It is called Will the Real Terrorist Please Stand Up? And it is my pleasure to welcome Saul Landau to Studio 4 to tell us more.
Well, the film takes 50-plus years of U.S.-Cuban history as told through violence, which is basically the leitmotif of U.S. policy, or has been for most of those years. And we meet the terrorists who talk into camera and proudly boast, or some of them have a little bit an air of repentance, but most of them are quite proud of what they did, although I can't see that it accomplished too much. And we go in and we meet the other side, the Cuban secret police, some of whom surface for the first time in this film, as well as U.S. former FBI agents and a variety of right-wing, left-wing people who tell the story in their own words. Not
to forget Fidel Castro. You landed an interview with himself.
Yes, at his house. And he's, as I told you before, he's really retired, surrounded by books and grandchildren, but still eloquent. And he tells a very crucial part of the story about the shoot down of two civilian airplanes that had intruded on Cuban airspace. And this was the incident that caused the, essentially led to the arrest of these 5 Cuban agents who had been sent into the United States to stop terrorism against Cuba. And their information was being fed back to the FBI. And the FBI, ironically, arrested their own sources, their own informers. The terrorists, of course, are living the life of Riley in Miami, having fundraisers, while the 5 are serving long prison sentences in the United States.
So, take me back to the beginning of it all. Batista, a ragtag group of guerrillas, not that ragtag, led by Castro, take over.
Yes, this is January 1959, when the Revolutionary Army takes control of Havana, and within months, exiled Cubans from South Florida are flying old planes back to Cuba and dropping bombs.
And not hitting targets.
Well, they're hitting targets, but not the ones they want.
They're not so good at this.
No, they're not so good at it, but they are killing people and destroying property. The Cubans complain, and Eisenhower, when informed about this, says, well, why don't the Cubans just shoot the planes down? But he doesn't stop the overflights. And within months, the CIA takes charge of this operation and begins a plan to overthrow the Cuban government, which comes to a head at the Bay of Pigs in April 1961, which is probably the biggest military loss the United States has ever suffered in Latin America. And Castro then, from then on, has not been properly punished for disobedience. I guess that's the way to put it.
And killing Castro has been on the agenda, I'm assuming, on the agenda of most of the presidents who have led the United States, or not?
Well, many of them. Yes, many of them have, or the CIA has, tried to assassinate Castro. The number given is 638 times. I don't know, but it's around that. And I think one has to credit Castro not only with exporting his enemies to his larger enemy, that is, we have them now in the United States, and as a result, we had President George W. Bush instead of President Al Gore. They were decisive in that election, not by votes, but by other means.
The Cuban vote.
It wasn't just the Cuban vote, it was intimidation, fraud, a whole bunch of things. They played a very big role. And in addition, Fidel succeeded in obsessing his enemies, so they couldn't think clearly, and therefore they think only of killing him.
So the right-wing Cuban organizations in Miami, in Dade County, wherever they are, the right-wing organizations are allowed to work freely, do what they do in the United States, in Cuba?
Well, not in Cuba, but they do go to Cuba for nefarious reasons, or they hire Salvadorans to do bombings in Cuba, which we show in the film. But I call the Miami the, autonomous Republic of Miami. It has, as we show in the film, its own foreign policy, and the Cuban agents had about as much chance of getting a fair trial as a Jew would have had in Berlin in 1938.
Right. So when you walk down the street in any city in the United States or in Canada and ask the question, who are the Cuban Five? Well, what response do you get?
Most people have never heard of the Cuban Five. And in the film, some people thought they were a basketball team. Others
a salsa band.
A rock group. But these are 5 really political prisoners who were anti-terrorists trying to stop violence and tipping off the FBI about caches of explosives and arms. And instead, the FBI arrested them, and they're sitting in for long sentences. One is getting out on October 7th, Rene Gonzalez. And ironically, the judge has imposed a strange condition on him, that he remain in Miami for 3 years, which is the equivalent of putting a bullseye on his chest.
Well, you're so married to this story, so I want to be clear. The Cuban Five, living in Cuba, going to Miami to invade or infiltrate the terrorist groups who are sending bombs to Cuba.
Yes.
And these groups in Miami are made up of Cuban exiles.
Correct. But they hire Salvadorans to do the dirty work. In other words, they don't take the risk themselves, but they hire, on the cheap, Salvadoran hitmen, bombers, and so on, to plant bombs in Cuban hotels, restaurants, bars. One of them killed an Italian tourist, Fabio Di Celmo.
Right.
And the idea behind this was to prevent tourists from going to Cuba. Canadians and Europeans who frequent Cuba, certainly in the winter months, go to Cuba. If they planted bombs in the hotels, they'd be much less likely to go, and this was the aim of it.
So innocents are being killed, and somebody said in the film, I think it was it Orlando Bosch?
Yes.
Who's he?
Orlando Bosch was one of the people who earned the title of the Bin Laden of the Western Hemisphere.
Okay.
He, along with another cohort, put a bomb on a Cuban airplane over Barbados in 1976, killing all 73 passengers and crew members. At the time, it was the worst act of terrorism the world had seen.
But an act that we don't pay much attention to, or didn't pay much attention to. Most people don't even really know about it.
No, tomorrow is the 35th anniversary of that, and it is an incredible story because he didn't feel one bit sorry. In the film, as you said, he said, when women, children, and so on die, well, that's unfortunate.
It's unfortunate. Stuff happens.
Yes, exactly.
It's unfortunate. So back to the trial of the Cuban Five. On a dark and stormy night, the FBI comes in and pulls them out of their beds, or what?
Yes, exactly. They arrest them, and they hold them for quite
what?
Well, initially they held them on a charge of failing to register as foreign agents. It was the one charge they were guilty of. However, no one's ever been prosecuted under that law. Usually the FBI, when they don't want them there anymore, just deport them, because Americans are doing exactly the same thing in 50, 60 countries. They infiltrate groups that they think are going to perpetrate violence against the United States. So it's a well-known operation.
It's intelligence.
Of course.
It happens all the time.
They're not spying on the United States, they're spying on Cuban exile groups.
In the United States.
In the United States, because the FBI is not stopping them from doing their terrorism in Cuba.
Right. The Cuban exiles are sending planes over Cuba and dropping bombs not in the right places, and nobody's stopping it.
No.
It sounds like fantasy.
Yes. It sounds like fantasy, and it's a stain on the United States' reputation. I mean, here we are, the war against terrorism. I remember George W. Bush saying on television, "He who harbors a terrorist is as guilty as the terrorist." Well, we could have excused him because people said he didn't understand what the word harbors meant.
Wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
We can't say the same for our current president, a former constitutional law professor.
Right.
And for the agencies that are supposed to be monitoring this. But
or for Bill Clinton or whatever.
But I mean, essentially we've got now 3 groups of terrorists. There are bad terrorists, and they're Muslims, there are good terrorists, those are freedom fighters, and they attack Fidel Castro and Cuba. And then there are crazy terrorists who don't fit into either of the other categories.
So your question in the title of the film, who is the real terrorist? Will the real terrorist please stand up? But going back to the Cuban Five, arrested, go to trial in Miami, in some place in Miami, Dade County. Wasn't there a lawyer who said, excuse me, but we need to change the venue?
Yes, there was, and the judge denied that. And the members of the jury had their license plates photographed repeatedly, so they were identified. And every one of them understood that he or she gave an improper decision, that means acquittal. The best that could have happened to them was to have their house burned down.
But the sentencing, the original sentence, I know it's gone to appeal and come back, is, well, I don't know if it's draconian because I don't know who's innocent and who's guilty, but I would suggest that going to prison for 15 years consecutive life.
Two consecutive life
sentences.
Plus 15 years, that's what one of them has, for the charges of conspiracy to commit espionage, not espionage. There was no evidence he committed espionage. Conspiracy, he talked to somebody else about spying on Cuban exiles. That was the conspiracy. And aiding and abetting murder. The shoot down of the 2 airplanes that intruded on Cuban airspace, which, having flown over Cuban airspace, that's not a crime. That is, they were told not to come. They would be shot down if they came in. They came in, they got shot down. If a Cuban plane had flown over Washington, imagine.
Imagine, shot down immediately.
So, and how could a relatively low-level Cuban agent in Florida know that the Cuban president had decided to shoot the planes down? So the decisions and the sentencing were beyond draconian. They were ridiculous. And the only thing I can imagine is the judge had one of those Soprano the episodes where somebody meets her in the supermarket and says, "You've got nice grandchildren, Judge."
It's quite startling still, and remains startling. I know. We'll take a break and come back and talk more with Saul Landau. Will the Real Terrorist Please Stand Up? Part of the Vancouver International Film Festival, screening tonight at 6:40, Friday at 3 p.m., Tuesday, October 11th at 1:30 p.m. Will the Real Terrorist Please Stand Up?